In this video, we'll discuss how you can use Alpha Anywhere to create REST APIs. So typically, when you create a REST API, you are exposing some functionality that was defined in either an XBasic class or a Node API. So let's start out and create a really simple REST server. So first thing we'll do is we'll go to this XBasic section here in the web control panel, and we'll create a new class where we'll define the method that we want to expose through this REST API. So we'll go here and we'll say new, and then we'll choose create a new XBasic class. And just to avoid having to type it in again, I'm going to just copy the class definition from the clipboard here and then paste it in. So go ahead there and paste. So you can see here we're creating a XBasic class called REST, my REST API. So this is the namespace and this is the actual name of the class. And you can see that this class defines a single method called getData. It's a very simple method. It doesn't take any input parameters over here, and it just returns some data. So we'll go ahead now and we'll save this class. You can see that Alpha suggests the name of the file based on the class name over there, so we'll go ahead and hit save, and then we can test this class in the interactive window by just going over to the interactive window and saying say dim p as p, that was wrong, so delete p, dim p as, and then we're going to dim it as our class, and then p dot get data. Let's just put a question mark in front of it, and we can see that our class returns that data. So this is a very simple XBasic class, and we'd now like to expose this method get data through a REST API. So we'll go back to the web control panel, and now we'll go to the web services section, and we'll click on the new button over here, and we'll choose create a REST service. And now we'll choose the name of the XBasic class that contains the method that we'd like to expose. So we'll go there and choose this my REST API class, and these are all of the methods in that class. So in this case, this class was very simple. It only had a single method, but the class could have many different methods in its definition. And here we choose which of those methods we would like to expose in our REST API. So at this point, the little red icon over here indicates that this method has not yet been exposed. So let's go ahead now and click on edit method properties. We'll say we would like to export it. So once we've specified that we would like to expose this method in our service, the next thing we need to choose is the REST verb that we would like to use. So in this case, we're just going to be using a get, because we're just doing a query here. We're not actually going to be doing any updating of information, which typically would use a post verb, so we'll just use a get. This method doesn't have any arguments, so there's nothing really else that we need to do here. We don't need to specify how the arguments are going to be supplied to the method, so we'll just go ahead now and click OK. And you can see now the little red icon has changed to green, indicating that this method is now going to be exposed, and also this little icon here indicates that this is not an authenticated method. So now we'll go ahead now and hit the save button, and I'll just call this my REST service 1. Go ahead now and hit save. And basically, now that we've actually saved the method, we can test it. So let's go ahead now and test it. Do a live test of the API. So we'll go ahead now, and that's going to basically open up our browsers. Our server is running, and the browser is going to be opened up, and here we can see our endpoint. We can click on the this method to test it. And let me just resize this window. So you can see that in this tester here, there's a button called try it out. So we'll go ahead there, and then I'll click the execute button, and you can see that our REST service has been called. There's the response that we got. This is the curl command in order to call this endpoint. You can see the endpoint has a web address over here, which So we're continuing now with our demonstration of creating a simple REST API in Alpha Anywhere, and we've just tested our API in the browser. So over here we're actually showing the curl command that would be necessary in order to make this REST call. This is the response we got from the REST call. Now if we go back to Alpha, we can go over here and we can actually see the Swagger definition of this API that we've just defined. So Swagger is an open source standard for describing REST APIs. So this is how we've described this API that we've just defined using Swagger. We can also get documentation for this API. Now this is obviously a very simple API, but you can see here we've generated the documentation automatically for the API. And you can also import different API definitions from Swagger. So what we've shown in this video is how to take a very simple method defined in an XBasic class and expose that method through a REST API. Thanks very much for watching. In the previous video we created a REST API to expose an XBasic method in a class that was very simple. The method didn't require any arguments. In this video we're going to create a new method in the class that requires an argument and show how we expose that through a REST API. So let's go here and edit our XBasic class, and in the interest of saving time I'm just going to copy the class definition from the clipboard. So I'll go here and paste in a new class definition, and you can see that what this class does is so the class is called getCustomers. It takes as its argument customer ID, and then it makes a SQL query against the sample Northwind database and finds all of the fields for the customer ID that matches the passed in argument. So this getCustomers method now takes a single argument. So let's go ahead and save this, and then we can go to the interactive window and test out this new method that we've defined. So we'll go over here and we'll say dim_p as an instance of this class, and then we'll go here and say p.getCustomer, and I'll type in one of the customer IDs from the Northwind customer table, and so that would be ALFKI, and then press enter. So we can see that the class returns an object with a bunch of properties in it. So let's go now and see how we can expose this class in our API. So we'll go back to the web projects control panel, and now we'll go over to services and we'll edit our service, and we can see here that we have shown over here are all of the methods for this service, and you can see I've already turned on the getCustomer method. So let's go and start from scratch. I'll turn it off again now. So now the new method here, getCustomer, has not yet been exposed in the service, so we want to expose it. So we'll go there and say edit method properties, go there and choose that, and we can see now that this method has arguments. You can see that the argument customer ID is shown over here, and so now we can go ahead and choose how this method will be called, what verb will be used. So we can choose a get, and then we can specify how this customer ID argument will be passed in. It could be passed in as part of the path as we've defined over here, or it could be passed in as a query parameter. So you can see if we bring up the help on exposing web services, you can see that one of the ways in which a query, an argument can be passed in is as part of the query parameters, like for example over here, or it can be passed in the path itself as we've shown over here. So in this case we're going to be passing in the argument in the query string, i.e. in the path, and so let's go ahead now and click OK, You can see now that we have a green icon there indicating that this method has now been exposed. So we'll go ahead now and click Save, and then we'll do a live test of this API endpoint. So go ahead there. The browser opens up. I'll just resize the browser so we can see all of it. And then we'll go ahead here and test out this new endpoint. We'll hit the Try It Out button, and we'll type in our customer ID, which will be ALFKI, and then click on the Execute button. And you can see there's the result of our API call, and you can see also here the curl command shows how this API call was made, and you can see that the customer ID is part of the URL that was used to make the call. So what we've shown over here is how to expose a method that takes parameters, and how you can define the REST API, specifying exactly how the parameters are going to get passed to the method. Thanks very much for watching. In this video we'll discuss how you can add authentication to various methods in the API that you're defining. So you can see here we have a really simple API that exposes two methods, getCustomer and getData, and currently both of these methods are not authenticated. So you can see here that the little icon indicates that these are public methods, they're not authenticated. But let's say we would like to authenticate the getCustomer method. So in order to do that, we first need to turn on authentication for certain methods in this API. So we'll go ahead here and we'll require authentication, and when we click this button to define the authentication, we'll go here and we'll say add a method. So you can create multiple different authentication methods. So a named authentication method is just a name that you give to a series of properties. So I'll just call this auth1. And then you can see that to define this named authentication method auth1, we need to specify the name of an XBasic class that contains a method that will be used to perform the authentication. We can also specify that the authentication will be performed by some node function as well, but we'll just keep it simple and choose XBasic right now. And then we'll need to choose the name of the class that contains our authentication method. So at this point we've not yet defined the authentication method. So let's basically close this out and go and define a method that will perform this authentication. So we can create this method in any class. We can create a brand new class, or we can add this authentication method to this existing class that we have right now. So we'll go ahead and edit the class, and I'm going to just go here and type in a new method. So function authenticate, and this function must return a numeric value, which is an HTTP status code. So end function. So a status code of 200 is used for allowed, and a status code of 401 would be used for not allowed. So I'm going to go here and actually hard code in a status code of 401. So this is going to basically disallow the API call. So now we have authenticate equals 401. So we'll go ahead there and save that. Now we'll go back to defining our named authentication method. So we can go here and say that the class that contains the method is this class over there, and the method that we're going to use to authenticate this API calls is this authenticate method. So now that we've defined our named authentication, we can go over to this getCustomer method here, edit the properties of it, and turn on authenticated, and then specify the name of the named authentication method to use. So we only have one, which is auth1, so we'll choose that method over there. Go ahead and click OK, and we can see now that the icon changes now to the lock. So let's go ahead now and save this, and then do a test of this API in our browser. So we'll open up the tester, and we'll go over to the getCustomer method over there, and we'll try it out. So we'll go there now and hit the execute button, we need to type in a customer ID, so I'll just type in ALFKI and then hit the execute button. And we see now that the response code is 401 and that this API call here was not authorized. So what we've shown in this video is how you can add authentication to the API calls that you define when you're exposing methods in a REST API. Thank you very much for watching. In the previous video we showed how we hard-coded the authentication method to return a 401 status code which disallowed the API call. So let's go now and edit our authentication method and change it from a 401 to a 200, which would allow the API call to be made. So obviously in a real application you would have much more complex logic over here to decide whether or not to authenticate the API call. But in this simple example we're just going to hard code our response. So we'll go ahead there and now hit the save button, and now we'll go ahead and test the get customer endpoint. So we'll go there and type in the customer ID and then go ahead and hit the execute button, and now you can see that we get a status code of 200 and the API call is allowed and the API call returns some data. So using XBasic methods or node code that you create, you can easily write custom methods to authenticate each one of the methods exposed in your REST API. Thank you very much. When you create a REST API, you might want to audit the use of the API. So for example, you might want to keep track of how often a particular method that is exposed by your API is called, or how long a particular method takes to execute, so that you can see if your API is performing well. You might also want to keep track of how often an API is being called, so that you can implement some type of rate limiting scheme to ensure that the API is not being abused. So in order to implement auditing, you turn on the auditing feature by clicking the Audit API checkbox, and then to define the details of the audit method, you click the button, and you can see here that the audit method requires you to specify a class which can either be written in XBasic or Node, and this class needs to implement two specially named methods, one called begin audit and one called end audit. So we'll just click here to get the sample definition on the clipboard, and we'll copy that definition to the clipboard, and then we'll specify that these two methods, begin audit and end audit, are going to be defined in this class that we've previously been working with. So we'll go ahead there and click OK, click edit class, and we're going to put these two audit methods in this class here. So I'm going to just go there and hit paste, get rid of the begin class and end class over here, and you can see that what we have is a method called begin audit that currently is empty, and another method called end audit, and this method is going to create data, it's going to write data into a file called rest log in my C:\data folder, and this log file will contain the name of the method that was being called, and also how long it took to execute that method in milliseconds, and then it'll enter a new line so that basically each entry in the log starts on its own new line. So you can see that these two methods, begin audit and end audit, take as an argument a special XBasic object called helper : service rest audit, which contains these properties, method name and milliseconds. This particular object also contains another variable called host, which was the which is information about the host. So let's go ahead now and save this, and we'll go there and hit save. And now let's go and test this API. So we'll go there and click on the test button. We'll go over there, we'll do try it out, we'll type in, hit Alf key, hit the test button. Now let's go here and test it one more time with, say, bollard, and then hit execute. Now let's go up to the second method that was defined here, which is this let's just go ahead here, just scroll down here, and I'm just trying to get it onto the screen so that it can be seen. So let's bring this up there, and here we go, there's get data. So we'll go ahead there and try this method out and hit execute. And now let's pause and go over and take a look at what the log file contains. So here we are in the C:\data folder, and let's open up the log file in Notepad to take a look at it. So we can see here in our log file that the first call to get customer took 16 milliseconds, the second call took 0 milliseconds, and the first call to get data took 15 milliseconds. So basically, using the audit feature, we can keep track of how many times different methods that are exposed in our API get called, and we can keep track of how long each one of those methods takes to execute. Thanks very much for watching.